Welcome and good afternoon. Today we will continue with our NPTEL MOOC course on tribal studies in India, interdisciplinary perspectives and approaches. We have come quite a far now from where we have started, from trying to understand the concept of tribe, the different ways in which, tribal communities have been studied, in the sense that the methodologies, the theoretical perspectives pertaining to tribal studies in India, and also we have covered significant topics in relation to tribes, particularly in the context of the socio-cultural political history of the communities. Now following from where we have started, I think a very important part of every community history in India is the history of colonialism. Now in the context of tribes as well, the encounter with the colonial state is something which is very important. And in the last few lectures we have looked at the incursion of the colonial state into tribal territories, and we have learned that the encounter between the colonial state and the tribal communities in India was something which was very violent. Now although we only talk about the context of the Lushai or the Mizo communities in Northeast India, the experience in terms of the way in which the Lushais or the Mizos today were subjugated by the colonial state is an experience which is something very common across tribal communities. Now today we will move ahead of that particular topic, because we have already understand that tribal communities over a period of time were integrated into the larger colonial state. Now what happened after the integration of tribal communities within the colonial state? Now all of us know by now that as a community in many parts of India, tribal communities have their own distinct political institutions. They have their own system of governance. Sometimes we normally refer to it as customary, sometimes we refer to it as traditional institutions. So what are the ways in which the British responded or engaged with tribal governance in India? And we will also, through this lecture, we will also try to understand the impact, or how the kind of political institutions or the kind of legislations that were introduced by the British continue to resonate even in post-colonial India. So this lecture number 23 is titled Tribes During the Colonial Rule, Administration of Tribal Areas, Laws and Legislations. Now at the outset I would like to also make this point that the governance of tribal communities in India was very diverse, in a sense that there was no uniform laws and legislations that was implemented in the entire country. So across India you will see that the British have resorted to different mechanisms and ways in which they were governing the tribal populations. However, what is also important is that these policies, these legislations which were crafted by the colonial state were more or less in response to the nature of their encounter with the tribal communities. So during the colonial period, the British introduced several laws and legislation with regard to tribal areas, and these laws and legislations have the administrative side as well as the laws concerning the resource rights, particularly land, water and forests. Now the assumption, the larger assumption driving the introduction of laws and legislations pertaining to tribal communities was that these communities are distinct, these communities are unique and different, and the belief was that modern laws are unsuited to the tribal communities because they are primitive and they are backward. Now some of the most prominent laws that were introduced by the British includes, for instance, the Forest Rights Act. And on the governance and administration side, we have legislations like the Excluded Areas Act of 1846, the Government of India Act 1919. Now like I said, tribal areas or tribal communities are quite spread out all over the country. Now what happened is that it was very difficult for the British to introduce similar kinds of laws and legislations. But then despite that in post-colonial India, that is after after India attained independence, many of the laws that were introduced by the colonial state continued to be followed and practiced, of course with some revisions, but it continues to be used, particularly in terms of governing tribal populations in independent India. Now let us look at what are the historical backdrop of their introduction. Why is it why do the British think that there has to be different kind of laws and legislations pertaining to tribal communities in India? Colonial administration of tribal areas can be mapped to the regulation of forests and specific legislations for tribal areas. Now like I said, the British instituted a different regime of governance specifically for the tribal communities in India, particularly by introducing different set of laws and legislations. Now these laws and legislations primarily aim one thing, which is they try to create they follow the policy of isolation, that is isolating tribal communities from the larger Indian society, which eventually led to the seclusion of tribal groups from mainstream society. Now the impact was not only in terms of creating two different zones in which two different kinds of laws and legislations were implemented, but then it also resulted into the territorial segregation between hills and the plains, where at times, most of the times, the hills were subjected to exceptional laws because they were the hill areas in India, particularly in regions like Northeast India, are predominantly inhabited by tribal communities. Now what the colonial laws and legislations did was not only introducing a law. Now when the laws came into force, it does have a lot of impacts in the ground. One of the impact was this segregation between the hills and the plains, that the British segregate the hills, people living the hills, and people living in the plains. Now one of the most important law that was introduced by the British was the Bengal Eastern Frontier Regulation Act 1873, which popularly is known as the Inner Line. The Inner Line is was enforced in places like Lushai Hills, places like Naga Hills, and the Northeast Frontier Tract, which is present day Arunachal Pradesh. Now when the British introduced the idea of implementing the BEFR, it was basically to keep the tribes out of the keep away the tribes from the mainstream society. Now of course the British did make a lot of justification as to why the Lushais or the Nagas need to be kept out or be excluded, primarily because yes, they know that these communities have a distinct culture, these communities have a distinct traditions. But the other part was that the British have their own interests at the back of their mind when they introduce these laws. Now what is the Inner Line? Now the Inner Line basically is that anyone who wanted to enter into the territories which are defined in areas where the BEFR is implemented, they need to take a special permit. Now why is this law important? It is essentially important because if you look at present day state like Nagaland, Mizoram, and Arunachal Pradesh, the Inner Line permit is still enforced, and today I think from December 2019, the Bengal Eastern Frontier Regulation Act is enforced in the state of Manipur as well. So therefore, like I said, it is important to understand the historical context of these laws and legislations, because it continued to define tribal policies in terms of laws and regulations, legislations in the post-colonial period. So like I said, one of the primary aim was to isolate the tribal communities, and this idea of isolating the tribal areas stems from the idea of what the historian Sanghamitra Mishra called legal primitivism. Now what is legal primitivism? Legal primitivism essentially is the idea that a dominant legal system views primitive rules and practices as inherently different and inferior. Now basically there are two ways of explaining this. One is that the assumption that tribes are primitive, right? We always talk about how this idea of primitive, the primitiveness of the tribes is something which is inherent in every tribal society or in every tribal communities. Second is that the belief that see, as they are primitive, the kind of modern laws are unsuited for tribal communities. So therefore on the one hand, because of their primitive culture, because of their primitive nature, so therefore the kind of rules, the kind of customs that tribals are following are inherently inferior. They are different, but they are inferior. On the other hand, this also implies that tribal communities cannot be governed using the same modern laws in the way in which non-tribal communities are being governed. Now the legal primitivism, according to Sanghamitra Mishra, was used as an excuse to label certain groups as unreliable and unchanging, making them seem isolated from history in colonial narratives. Now this is just an extension of the idea of legal primitivism, in a sense that there is this implicit assumption with the idea that tribal communities are unreliable and unchanging, in the sense that they are frozen in time, they are static, they are changeless communities. Tribal communities does not respond to any kind of change that is happening. So therefore, the British use this idea of legal primitivism as a way to justify the exclusion of tribal communities from the larger mainstream Indian society. For instance, in Northeast India, the East India Company introduced customary laws and traditional leadership among tribes for governance and to meet its need for revenue. Now, in many parts of Northeast India, we already know that much of the population in Northeast India are predominantly tribal communities. Now, in all of these places, irrespective of the different structures of institutions and legislations that are being introduced, one of the commonalities that you will see is that the British actually have used the customs, actually use customs or customary institutions, traditional institutions to govern the vast majority of tribes. The colonial laws and legislations resulted in governing all tribal communities under the similar regulations, which resulted in institutionalizing, for instance, the chiefs and Garo tribes, which were hitherto governed by communal assemblies and judicial interventions following the British regulations. Now, in many parts of tribal areas, what happened is that the colonial state have was trying to govern through already existing institutions. Now, in many parts of India, in many parts of tribal areas which have chieftainship system, they have used the chiefs to be the agent of the government. Now, in many parts of India, again it is not always that tribal communities have already political institutions. Many a times they have a different kind of institutions where there is no centralized authority. Now, in that kind of situation, sometimes the British also use or appoint chiefs, or at times they appoint new kind of agents in the form of sirdars based on their character, general behavior and local influence. In the hills of Manipur, they have introduced agents like the Limbus. In Lusai Hills in today Mizoram, they have introduced something known as the circle interpreter. Now, among the Nagas, they have introduced the Gaunbura, for instance. Now, if you look at it, while the British claim that tribal communities have their distinct customs and traditions, and their customs and traditions needs to be respected, but on the other hand, you will also actually see that the British have introduced new kinds of systems of governance within the tribal communities. So, the aim behind installing chiefs or appointing chiefs among the hill tribes was to maintain oversight over political and judicial affairs, and to ensure flow of forest revenues, products such as cotton and timber. Now, at the end of the day, it all boils down to one thing, that is the colonial interest is at the top. Now, it was not that the British were very much concerned about the welfare of the tribal communities. Rather, it becomes more easy for them. It becomes financially more financially less inexpensive for them if they are capable of governing the tribes through existing institutions, or by introducing few agents who will aid the colonial state in terms of collecting revenues in relation to, say, forest products or cotton and timber. Now, therefore, it is for this reason that if you look at a critical analysis by scholars who have looked at the way in which the colonial state engaged with the tribe, particularly when it comes to laws and regulations, you will see that it is defined by a strong idea of paternalism. Because the idea of paternalism essentially is that the British thinks that they know what is best for the tribal communities. Therefore, they think that it is in the interest of the tribes. They are doing favor to the tribes by secluding them from the mainstream communities, because if the tribals come in contact with the mainstream communities, then they might get exploited, or if they come into contact with the mainstream communities, then they might get assimilated, which will eventually lead to the loss of their culture, identity, so on and so forth. Now, moving ahead, similarly, tribal communities residing in the plain regions were also directly or indirectly affected by the different administrative laws and legislations. It is not that every tribal communities live in the hills. It is not always that all the tribal communities live in the forests. Many tribal communities, whether they are in mainland India, whether they are in Northeast India, they also live in different geographic spaces, and this includes the plain areas as well. Now, if you look at Assam, for instance, you will see that many tribal communities, say Bodos, Kacharis, they also live in the foothills, they also live in the plains. So therefore, the new legislations that were being introduced in respect pertaining to the tribes equally affected all tribal communities irrespective of the geographical regions they reside. In 1793, Lord Cornwallis implemented the zamindari system, also called the permanent settlement, that primarily benefited those loyal to the British rule. It was mainly enforced in Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. Now, with the introduction of this permanent settlement came the idea of institutionalizing zamindari system in India, particularly in terms of collecting revenues from land. Now, this land tenure system gave zamindars, who were the landlords, hereditary ownership of land in return for a fixed tax payment to the British government. Now, you know that for the colonial state, one of the biggest source of revenue was essentially from land, right. The vast majority of people in India were largely dependent on agriculture, basically on land. Now, therefore, one of the way in which the colonial state try to extract the maximum out of ruling India is basically by getting as much as revenue to land, to taxation from land. So, zamindars all over where these permanent settlement were introduced gained private ownership of land, allowing them to treat land as a marketable commodity. Now, land was divided into small parcels, leading to multiple feudal lords controlling different sections, and this has disrupted traditional tribal economy, as tribal lost their customary rights over agricultural land. Now, the introduction of the permanent settlement, particularly the zamindari system, resulted into the erosion of tribal rights over their agricultural land, which over a period of time increased their dispossession as well as their pauperization. For instance, the introduction of permanent settlement in tribal areas in Bengal abolished the traditional practice of collective and traditional ownerships of land, known as the Khutkhoti system. Furthermore, the colonial state, they also established a cash-based market economy in tribal areas, increasing the influence of intermediaries such as money lenders and traders. Now, in many tribal society, if you look at it, definitely I don't want to paint a very simple kind of image about the tribal communities, but then over a period of time, with the expansion of the colonial state into the into the tribal areas and tribal territories, what you see is that there are new kind of agents, new kind of institutions that were emerging. Now, one of them were the money lenders and the traders. Now, under the hands of these money lenders and traders, tribals suffered immensely, and the suffering of tribals worsened due to the exploitation by outsiders, including police, traders and money lenders. So, therefore, you will see that the moment the outsiders in terms of money lenders and traders have emerged in tribal areas and territories, what happened is that it started resulting into creating tensions between the tribal population and the non-tribal population. Now, in places like Jharkhand, you will see that many a times tribal assert themselves politically, socially, culturally against who they call Dikus, that is the outsiders or the non-tribals. Now, in many parts of Northeast India also, there is a strong suspicion about outsiders coming in, taking over their economy. So, this experience of exploitation in the hands of the outsiders has resulted into a confrontation or a kind of tension between the tribal populace and the non-tribal population. This new system created widespread resentment and unrest among tribal communities as they were displaced and deprived of their livelihood. As a result of tribal settlements, tribal resentments against the colonial administration which undermined the tribal autonomy, certain laws were introduced to pacify and isolate tribal areas. So, basically over a period of time, with the intrusion of the colonial state and the introduction of new agents such as money lenders, traders, judiciary, police, so on and so forth, there was a lot of tension between the colonial state and the tribal populace. Now, you see that it was essentially this experience of exploitation which act as the catalyst for a lot of resistance during the colonial period. As a response to the continued resistance, the continued raids, the continued unrest in tribal areas, colonial administration introduced new legislations and laws that will isolate the tribal communities from the larger Indian society or the non-tribal population. So, we started seeing new legislations which are being introduced, and we will just quickly run through them. One of the first legislations which was introduced was the Excluded Areas Act of 1876. Now, like I said, different laws, different legislations were introduced by the British in the last during the period of colonial rule. It was not that these laws and legislations were applied uniformly all over India. According to the reasons, according to the situation, different laws and different legislations were introduced. Now, specifically in relation to the Excluded Areas Act of 1846, it originated in the Bombay Presidency pertaining to the hill forest areas, The act came into effect after the rebellion of a Bhil chief by the name Kaur Basava. Now, this is a report by this is a report by a British political officer who was posted in the Bombay presidency. Now, he wrote about the Bhil chief, saying that Jiva, like other Bhil chiefs in this part, has taken advantage of the time to establish his power and rights over the neighboring fertile districts. His family land consists of 84 villages in Raj Pipla. He became the dread of the surrounding country. He levied tribute from several zamindars, made passengers and merchants pay toll for their free transit through the country, and triumphantly boasted that at his whistle he could command the service of 4,000 bowmen. Now, so in India, most of the time when you talk about the colonial history, we are always talking about in terms of empires, in terms of kingdoms, but then there were also a lot of powerful chiefs, and these powerful chiefs particularly were found not only in Northeast India as well as in many parts of mainland India. One of them is the Bhil chief Kaur Basava. Now, this is a description given by the political agent Briggs. Then you will see that his influence is quite vast. He is a very, very powerful chief. Now, over a period of time in Bombay presidency, particularly in the area where the Bhils are living today, it is known as the Khandes region, which were actually maintaining a lot of autonomy even during the Mughal period, even during the colonial period. Now, they were not very happy. Many Bhil chiefs definitely work under the administration of the colonial state, but many chiefs refused to accept the sovereignty or the power and authority of the colonial state. So, there were many chiefs who revolted against it. Now, in response to the revolt, the British introduced this particular act known as the Excluded Areas Act of 1846. More popularly, this came to be known as the agency system, and where the act appointed a British agent in the Mawasi hill tracts of Khandes and Ahmednagar. Now, you will see that these are places which are in today's Maharashtra. The British agent, they were responsible for maintaining law and order and regulating the entry of outsiders into the tribal areas. Now, what did the act do? The act excluded the tribal areas from subjected to the legislation and laws for non-tribals. So, there is this segregation between the tribal space and the non-tribal space, and secondly, the entry of outsiders, the entry of any non-tribal population into these areas where the excluded areas were enforced was curtailed. Another important act which was introduced is known as the Scheduled District of 1874. Now, this law was introduced to bring areas where general regulations were enforced, even though the area was classified as non-regulation tract. Certain districts came to be declared as scheduled due to their tribal dominance, isolation and distinct customs, reasons which require special consideration and different legal frameworks than the rest of British India. Now, you can recall the argument made by Sanghamitra Mishra when she says that it is this idea of legal primitivism which the colonial state used to justify the introduction of different laws and legislation for the tribal communities in India. Why is this Scheduled District Act introduced in 1874? Is basically to be implemented in areas which have significant tribal population, who are geographically isolated, who have distinct customs, and who require special consideration and different legal framework, because they are essentially primitive, they are essentially backward, and they cannot be governed under the same law from the rest of British India. Now, the British laws applicable to the rest of India were not automatically enforced in these districts. It allowed the government to frame separate rules and laws for these areas. The Governor General had the authority to declare and modify the list of scheduled districts. A very important act which came into force in the early part of the 20th century was the Government of India Act of 1919. Now, the Government of India Act of 1919 was being reformulated in 1935. We will come to that as well, but we will try to understand the idea behind the introduction of the Government of India Act of 1919. The Act divided tribal areas into two categories. One category known as the backward tracts, areas which have a high tribal population requiring special governance. The second is the partially excluded areas. In these partially excluded areas, some British laws were made applicable, but with modifications. So, therefore, in the backward tracts, no laws were applicable, particularly pertaining to non-tribal population, or in areas which the colonial state referred to as non-tribal areas. Now, in partially excluded areas, what you see is that the British laws definitely were applied, but with certain restrictions or modifications. Based on the type of administration, the backward areas were divided into two kinds of spaces. One, where the administration was run through the nominated representatives, and second, in the most backward districts which were excluded from the constitutional reforms and laws for general public, the power was with governor. So basically you have one very centralized authority which looks into the everyday affairs of these regions. In the context of backward tract, it is the governor, but in the case of the partially excluded areas, it is the nominated representative who is the head of the institutions. So by and large, these areas were excluded from the jurisdiction of elected provincial governance. Now what does it do to the tribal communities? One is that it restricts the political participation of tribal communities because they were not allowed to or it does not allow them to participate in any provincial elections. So there was no political activity. Now if you look at the entire Indian national movement as well, it was for this reason that many tribal communities were unable to participate, take active participation in the Indian national movement. And at the same time, maybe or may not be, there was not much effort on the part of the nationalist leaders to reach out to the tribal areas as well. So when the colonial state began to introduce representative form, which may not be a very complete one, but a representative form of governance, tribal communities who are living under scheduled areas, particularly backward areas and partially excluded areas, they were not in a position to participate in any kind of democratic elections. So the governor was the one who is bestowed with the most power, and they have the power to make laws and regulations without provincial legislative interference. For the administration of tribal regions, the Government of India Act of 1919 provided for partially excluded areas. These areas, unlike the backward tracts, had limited representation in provincial councils. Provincial governments had some control, but governors had special discretionary powers. Now coming from from the Government of India Act 1919, so one of the latest act which continue to have very strong implications when it comes to tribal communities in post-independent India is the Government of India Act of 1935. Now this act also categorized tribal spaces into two distinct regions. One is the excluded areas. These areas were entirely under the direct rule of the governor. The provincial legislature had no authority over them. Laws made by the provincial government did not apply to these regions unless the governor specifically extended them. No representative was given to the people of these areas in the provincial legislatures. These regions covered northeast frontier, that is today's Arunachal Pradesh, Naga Hills, Lusai Hills. Now like I said, it was not that these laws and legislations were not implemented because the tribals demanded them. These laws and legislations were introduced and implemented not because the tribal communities needs special protection. It was the British who thinks that the tribals need special protection. The tribal communities in India need special kinds of laws and legislations to govern. So therefore the excluded areas came into force, particularly in areas which were defined as backward tracts. Formally by the Government of India Act of 1919, these areas were known as backward tracts. Now many of the laws that were applied in these regions under the Government of India Act of 1985 continue to be enforced even till today. So during the entire colonial period, if you look at the history of Mizo Hills, the history of Mizoram, Lusai Hills, Naga Hills, as well as the northeast frontier tract, you will see that there was minimal political activity that was happening. But from the 1930s and the 1940s onwards, political consciousness definitely began to develop among the communities, despite the fact that they were put under very excluded spaces where they were not allowed to move out of their territory. However, because of the different kind of exposure, because of the different kind of political events that were happening globally, say the First World War, the Second World War, and many other things, the introduction of modern education within these spaces. So political awakening did happen, but then the excluded areas, the imposition of this Government of India of 1935 limited in many ways the political participation of tribal communities in the larger anti-colonial movements as well. Now what about the partially excluded areas? These areas were primarily under provincial control, but the governor had the special discretionary powers. Laws passed by the provincial legislature could be applied only with the approval of the governor. Some representation was given to the tribal population, but their legislative role was limited. These partially excluded areas constitute the Chotanagpur Plateau, the Santhal Parganas, which is mostly in today's Jharkhand, and in northeast India, the Khasi and the Jaintia hills. Now, unlike the backward tract, which are totally secluded from the larger Indian society, in the partially excluded areas have some form of political participation. However, this was also something which was very limited, and they were strictly monitored and controlled by the colonial state. Overall, the Government of India Act was designed to help in the transition to self-government by establishing provincial legislatures and ministries with a limited voting systems. However, it did not grant the same rights to communities that were classified as tribes. Overall, the approach in governing tribal areas is often seen as paternalistic, as the image of tribal in colonial times was the group of people who cannot be assimilated in the mainstream society. Now, so at the start of the lecture, like I said, while these laws, were celebrated by the colonial state as, something that will work in the interest and benefit the tribal communities themselves, many scholars, have argued and criticized these laws and legislation because of the paternalistic tone that was in, the paternalism behind the introduction of these laws. But however, these laws and legislations which were introduced by the British continue to have strong implications in tribal societies or among tribal communities, particularly in post-independent India. Now, if you look at where the different structures of autonomy are being implemented, it is mostly implemented on the basis of the Government of India Act 1995, which made this distinction between partially excluded and excluded areas. Now, in post-independent India, that we begin to have two structures of autonomy, one the 5th schedule and the second the 6th schedule. 6th schedule came to be implemented for the northeastern part of India, and where it came to be implemented are in areas and regions which were mostly defined as excluded areas. Where the 5th schedule came to be implemented, they are mostly in regions which came to be known as the areas which are inhabited by tribal communities in mainland India, particularly in central India. So therefore, colonial policies, despite of the criticisms, despite of the many drawbacks, despite of its own limitations, continue to influence tribal administration even in post-colonial India. But by and large, it is undeniable that these laws and legislations had significant impact in the way in which we perceive tribal society, essentially because it reinforced the kind of policy of seclusion, policy of isolation, and by excluding tribal communities from the larger Indian society. So I will stop here. Thank you so much.